Okay, so hello and welcome to the next Ancerious discussion. Tonight's topic is how to make diplomacy and first contacts engaging. So we're going to be going over what is diplomacy and what is a first contact, establishing an RP goal, introducing adversity and challenge into these RPs, how to RP the language barrier, hostile escalation, how to handle multinational diplomacy or multinational first contacts, what not to do in a diplomacy and first contact RP, and good examples of such RPs within the Ancerious boundaries. So first off, what is first contact or diplomacy? Well, simply put, first contact is the first official meeting between two peoples or nations, regardless of what the outcome is. While there may be intermittent sightings or unconfirmed actions beforehand, first contact is the de facto moment where they properly meet. First contacts can happen in a variety of contexts. They can happen in space between ships, two nations communicating across long distance, representatives meeting face to face, or various other kinds of methods. Diplomacy was pretty easy. It's the profession, activity, or skill of managing international relations, typically by a country's representatives abroad. Diplomacy is an extremely broad category and could be anything from building alliances or forming trade pacts to, denouncing another person's nation or policy or demanding concessions. But both are integral parts of any nation RP. But despite this, they also tend to be the most boring and sort of overlooked part of nation RP, usually because players don't really easily know how to make such, straightforward and uneventful RPs interesting, so hopefully we're going to aim to change that. So the number one sort of thing is establishing an RP goal. So one of the main ways that diplomacy or first contact RPs in general can die out pretty quickly is by players not really knowing what to do or where to go in the RP. So just having a first contact between two people can lead to pretty much infinite outcomes. But if neither side is extremely focused on a particular outcome, or you haven't agreed something beforehand, it can often just sort of lead to them milling around and just sort of posting back and forth, talking about their nations, but not really leading anywhere. And, this is the same for open-ended diplomatic RPs, when, you agree to have a, diplomatic talk with somebody and there's no real agreed upon goal, it just sort of doesn't go anywhere sometimes. And this is especially the case for multinational ones. So, because of this, you really ideally want to set a goal in mind out of character. Talk to the other player, having an open-ended RP is perfectly fine, so long as you're both wanting to keep up the pace and interest, but have kind of a rough idea what sort of outcome you want and that's ideal for both parties. And then you can both work towards, this clear goal, which you can, focus the RP at, because, this could be a case of just two nations agreeing to further diplomacy after a first contact, or it could be, both agreeing to have an unwitting escalation into a bit of a fight, or it could be both of them agree to, a new pact after meeting each other. Just anything that's small like that is enough to, keep your RP centered and prevent it from drifting into sort of pointless or non-directed conversations, or just needless posts that don't really contribute to the forward momentum of the RP. And if you have a goal in mind, it kind of allows one of you, or both of you, or just anyone in the RP really, to act as sort of the, guiding force. So the moment things kind of get a bit off topic or waylaid or bogged down, someone in the RP, if they know the goal, can sort of make a post and steer things back to, the original track, rather than them adding to the, well, I'm not really sure what to do, so I'll just, have my guy explain what their nation's like or whatnot. It could be, oh, well, this is what my nation's like. But anyway, I believe that we should be doing this, etc., moving towards, say, nicer diplomacy, etc. Just anything to really help action, for the RP. I see a lot of first contacts where people just kind of like both turn up and then they say hi to each other and then they're like, yeah, this is kind of what my nation's like, and then the other person reciprocates and then nothing really happens, and it's like, well, come on, let's, have a goal in mind. What do you want out of this RP? So, it can also, ironically, and this goes for diplomacy and first contacts, it can actually, making an end goal and sort of determining what you want from the RP, tell you if you actually need to RP it at all. And that might sound kind of weird, but for example, if me and Blue decide that we're going to have a discussion between our two nation leaders on the current Third Ancerious War, and whether we should both get involved jointly and do several measures to help sort of mitigate it, that should be done in RP, because that will be pretty fun. We both have well fleshed out characters, it will be an interesting affair, it's going to contribute to the overall story, and we can have fun and sort of put in bits of spice and cool things here and there. But, for example, if Andromeda and Brank here decide that they want to have a bit of diplomacy where their two diplomats are discussing a trade agreement over materials, well, that doesn't really need an RP. There's not much that you can do within that writing space other than we both turn up, we both agree to this trade agreement with materials, we both leave the RP. In this sort of circumstance, you can determine by having the end goal result in, say, instead of doing an RP, you could do a news post or a journal. Just something that one of you can write pretty quickly and just post it up. This allows it to be canon, in character, it happens, but it doesn't force you both into a sort of like grinding, slow, boring RP that would be really uneventful and doesn't really contribute to the greater plot. So, it's critical to know when to actually RP out first contacts or diplomacy, or whether to actually write them up as background events, because especially if, say, me and Drac here decide that we want to have some cool story arc with our two factions, but we need to do a first contact, but the first contact's kind of bland, well, we could just skip the first contact and just say they met, or write up a news report or something, and then get straight into the first RP where things get interesting. Or, if you want it to get interesting in the first contact where stuff, goes down, that's cool, you can RP that out. It's no problem, So, creating these goals, or even a string of end goals through different events to create arcs, it's key. And as you go, you'll kind of learn what should be a news post, what should be a journal, what should be a proper sort of RP, but always talk to the other person, or anyone involved if it's multinational, and come up with an end goal, which is what you're going to be working towards. Whether that is just shooting the shit out of each other over a discrepancy or whatnot. So, the next sort of key is introducing adversity and challenge. And you might be thinking, what the hell, Myrick, we're talking about diplomacy and first contacts. Yeah, I know. But just like any good RP and any good story, there should be adversity and challenge. It adds excellent hurdles and problems that players need to overcome and articulate around to solve. And diplomacy and first contact should be no different. First contacts, for example, are tense affairs. Your nation has just suddenly been thrust into a situation where they now realise that there's another entire new people out there who have unknown goals, unknown capabilities, and an unknown drive that they're working towards. It's both a momentous moment, but it's also historical. And so the characters involved in that first contact are going to be pretty stressed because they want it to go well. Add that to, say, language translation issues, or ideological differences, or, the actual context of the meeting itself, depending on how you're meeting and where. And all of a sudden, this simple, you both turn up, sit down and chat, turns into both sides trying to like collect intelligence on each other because they're unsure of what they're, either side wants to do. Maybe one of your factions in the First Contact is trying to be the dominant power, is trying to sort of like bully and get a leg up on the other faction because it's in their best interests. Maybe one of the factions is trying to manipulate the other, feeding them false intel and stuff until they can actually find out what the other side wants. Any of these scenarios could occur and cause problems, and then you both have to try and work that around. And it just makes it a lot more interesting when you both turn up and there's things you have to work around rather than just boring sit down, have a chat, come away friends. These issues cause players to think, and while both may not in the end want a happy, friendly outcome, there can be some moments where, it comes to shots being fired due to, say, Andromeda's ship comes out of formation with like another vessel next to it, and it's interpreted as an intercept maneuver on the other side, and the other side decides, like, because there's been problems in language translation, because their sensors are having trouble identifying the enemy ship's power output, there could be a power spike because they're, putting more energy to their reactor. Well, that could be interpreted as, oh shit, there's a ship breaking formation coming on a perceived intercept course and it's powering weapons. We're going to get shot. We should respond in kind first before they get a chance to do that. So, all of a sudden, these affairs can add spice to the RP. It can also really help flesh out your nation, because how your nation handles first contacts, can tell a lot. You can tell readers a lot about your nation, and it can just help show how they conduct diplomacy on the macro scale and the individual scale. How do your ship captains, say, handle the fact that there's first contact? What, I guess, protocols are in place for your nation? How does your diplomat deal with talking to this nation for the first time? It all just sort of comes down to, another way to help, I guess, show off your nation in a tight scenario that isn't just casual talking. And adversity is also key to diplomacy as well, especially in large multinational sort of events. Challenges can come in many forms in diplomacy. It could just be somebody disagreeing with what's proposed, and, the other player having to try and convince them or coerce them with certain concessions or just rebuking them. It could come through just character interactions. I mean, certain leaders or diplomats might not like each other. And that might in itself create adversity. So while two nations are quite happily to make this new alliance, these two leaders don't actually like one another, and so they have to just sort of put on a smile for the camera and then have an argument behind back doors when they're trying to hash out the deal that's already, say, been solidified by the two governments, but the leaders don't agree on it because they both despise one another. That adds interesting adversity, and, considering the last discussion, helps flesh out stuff with your leaders or prominent individuals in your nation as well. And especially if you're interacting between two unfriendly nations, you can have a lot of verbal jousting and, twisting the narrative to try and suit different things going on. There's a lot of that at the moment in the Third Ancerious War, where both sides are trying to make it so that they have the moral high ground. There's lots of back and forth and any sort of diplomatic ongoings. It makes it just interesting, and it kind of reflects real life a little bit when somebody says something and somebody says the complete opposite, and they're both trying to say that they're right. Of course, though, when you do have adversity and challenge in such an RP, there is a risk of escalating it a bit too much. So, sometimes, I won't say this is particularly common, but I've seen it happen in these RPs, where, say in diplomacy, me and Drac again are having this, like, RP, and all of a sudden I decide that out of nowhere I'm going to assassinate Drax's character. Well, kind of a bit shit, because Drax now like, oh, my guy's dead. RP over, I guess. Like, what? And it kind of just, it's sort of the same in First Contact RPs, where things might be going okay, and then all of a sudden one side just decides to open fire. It's like, well, there's introducing adversity, but then there's also, like, train wrecking the RP, and if you're going to do something like a shock horror value, where it's like, hey, everything's good, and oh, suddenly so-and-so's just got assassinated, talk with the other person, for Christ's sake. It could be very good, it can take readers off guard, especially if there's like two friendly nations, and all of a sudden something happens and a well-known diplomat gets executed, and it's like, oh, fuck, stuff just got tense. But obviously, if those things do happen, they kind of quickly turn away from a diplomacy RP into something else, and sort of change the end goal entirely. But again, it's up to who you RP with. If you want to pull something like that off, if everyone's okay with it, then awesome. But, the key with any adversity is to know your RP partners well, or at least communicate and agree to big challenges beforehand. I can't tell you how many Diplo RPs that I've seen that have been ruined by sudden events that, throw the story out of whack. Not just assassinations, but just other things as well that sort of throw a spanner in the works, and suddenly the other player's like, don't really know how to respond to this, and I don't really know how the RP's going to continue either. And it just causes unnecessary issues. So, adversity, everyone's going to want to see it, but it's like a spice. Don't add too much, but don't add too little, Yes, Q Benny Hill theme, we'll get onto that later. You've all got a story in store for you that won't be going in the notes. So, next bit, how to RP the language barrier. So, this is kind of a big thing, but it's only a big thing I found in certain groups or with certain people. So, First Contact can result in species and nations communicating who realistically have no way of understanding each other. And this can be an interesting piece of adversity to overcome in a First Contact RP, and can give credence to the whole, like, oh no, they've unintentionally insulted my people, or they've misidentified something, and that sort of leads to threat escalation. But it can also be a barrier for the RP's progress and longevity, and so you kind of have to balance it accordingly. So, the first thing to know about the language barrier for, like, FCs is that it is not mandatory. At least in Ancerious, the fact that the AnkNet exists and that it has extremely robust and capable translation software effectively kind of negates the language barrier in First Contact RPs here, for the pure reason of it actually is supposed to get you sort of integrated. Players can easily contact one another, and you can make up whatever plausible means for yourself to, ignore the language barrier and facilitate this approach. That's fine. If you don't want to do the language barrier, you don't have to, for God's sake. The second thing to know is that no language is untranslatable, okay? In an age of extreme supercomputers and hyper-advanced AI, it isn't going to be perfect, and it's going to take time, but someone is going to crack your language and is going to be able to talk to you. Do not pull the, well, I have an unintelligible language, so there's no way that you can understand it. That trope is shit, and I tell people that they're bad every time they try and pull it out of their ass crack, So a good way to approach the language barrier in an RP is kind of one of two methods. The first, and this is actually writing it, if you're writing a post, okay, if you have a language written for your nation, write out what their kind of, I guess, language is and what they're saying, and then put in brackets sort of the translated what they actually said, and keep it all in character, cool, and understandable out of character. Or you can write it as third person, so like you can write instead, they would broadcast their intentions for peace and greetings from the ex-Federation, although it would be deep-rooted in their own language. This then shows, you know, they're not throwing random words out, but you don't have to just, I don't know, put random letters together and throw in apostrophes and be like, this is the Globnarkian language. It kind of looks weird. So those are kind of how you can write that, at least in character. But, you know, somebody's going to be able to translate your language, and any real nation that's worth their salt is going to try and help facilitate that translation. You know, usually you probably want to, like, use base numbers or something to that effect, you know, 0 or 1. Any sort of base things like that, as long as you can get that down, you have a basis for understanding a language. And that's pretty much what's going to happen in most scenarios. You know, there's no guarantee that it's going to be easily, I guess, discovered. And sometimes other factions kind of send translation software to help, although again, there's kind of no guarantee that your computers can run that either. But, you know, you need to understand that if you want to have the language barrier, don't have hurdles at every single step in the first contact that completely stonewalls any attempts to contact you. The first contact RP should not be focused on you and the other party for 20 turns of back and forth, being unable to translate a language, being unable to work anything on computer systems, being unable to, you know, interact meaningfully. You want the first contact RP to be focused on how your two nations interact for the first time, and how that can be used to make a foundation for interactions in the future. Yeah? So, if you are going to use a language barrier, it should be kind of like the initial hurdle. It should be the initial challenge, and once the first steps are made, you can then brush it aside later on to make way for the actual, like, RP, yeah? And information exchange to take place. You could then go on, if you wanted to be like having the occasional translation error in the RP. That can make it interesting. That could be like an occasional little, you know, hiccup when they say the wrong word, or they might mean something that they don't actually mean. That's cool. No problem there. But, you know, if your RP has failing to crack the language every turn and the other person's saying, we try again, it doesn't get anywhere, and it just kills the RP. And as sort of stated in context, if your race is not the kind of race to be helping facilitate communicate with other people's factions, and, you know, your whole thing is, oh, well, you can't translate our language and they're not going to try and help you, why are you in a first contact which is all about facilitating contact and communication? You kind of shot yourself in the foot and you're doing a pointless RP. Again, make a news journal of, we had contact with this faction, didn't get anywhere, boom, done, sorted. Nobody has to suffer through just painful, pointless writing. And I've had that happen many, many, many times, where people are just like, oh, let's do a first contact, and then they're the kind of like xenophobic, militarist nation who just don't want to have anything to do with you, you know. Just avoid that. Keep it for a journal or a news post. Don't go into that. It's just not worth it. And kind of on that same thing of good old xenophobic militarists, the next section is hostile escalation, because I'm sure more or less every one of you, if you've done Nation RP for any sense of time, has had a good old first contact where somebody that you're contacting decides, oh, well, I'm just going to use this as an opportunity to attack you and invade you and declare war on you. And all of a sudden they just start shooting in the first contact, and next thing you know that they're invading your empire. Well, I'm here to tell you, that's shit, that's not how you do it, and if you see people doing that, beat them over the head. You know, it is, of course, known not all first contacts end well, okay? And some do end up in outright fighting. But often escalation in first contact is done, as said, extremely poorly, and for some reason ends up in immediate fleet battles or even outright warfare. So first off, what's the reason for the escalation? Okay, just like you need a logical casus belli to invade and go to war with a nation, you need a logical reason to escalate in a first contact RP. Has the other nation insulted your people's penis size? Yes? Well, I'm sorry, but that's not a reason to start firing railgun slugs at them. It just isn't. Have they trespassed on your territory and your people don't want them to be there? Well, okay, have they ignored all of your demands to leave? If yes, then yeah, you can start shooting them. But on the same thing, if the other person has come to your territory to do a first contact and you want them to leave, you shouldn't be doing a first contact anyway, and again, you should be doing it as a news post. No reason to shoot them. Have they decided to kill your diplomat who went to the other ship because there has been a misunderstanding somehow where they thought that the diplomat was drawing a weapon when they weren't, he got shot dead, and now you think that they're escalating it? Sure. That's cool. Maybe fire off some shots. Again, earlier, is there a ship breaking formation and like powering weapons or something, or does it appear that way to you? Do you want to strike first? Sure. Those are the kind of instances where it's like, okay, you can start shooting in this first contact RP. Just know that if you are going to start shooting in a first contact RP, it does take the focus away from first contact, right? So that's kind of one of those adversities / challenges that you want to know with your opponent in advance. If you're both happy to start shooting in a first contact RP and that's the outcome that you want, awesome. If not, don't jump on people, fire like warning shots, whatever, but just be realistic on what's worth fighting over. Call out the other ship first or person first, rebuff any threats, make threats yourself. If all else fails and you've got no other option, fight. But just know that if you are going to try and escalate that first contact, you must be fucking ready to know who you're fighting with. Because, as somebody just put in comms text chat, if anyone's watched Babylon 5 and you know about the Earth Minbari War, you don't want to start shooting at a faction that is capable of utterly exterminating your species with no problems. You don't want to pick on an enemy who has completely unknown capabilities, completely unknown goals, how big they are, how powerful they are. Why would you want to try and escalate that with them? You want intelligence first. Even your super duper xenophobic military race shooting first doesn't actually make sense. They would want to collect information about what they're fighting and who they're fighting before start, shooting. Also know that when you are escalating a first contact RP into an open fight, keep it small scale, yeah? Couple of ships engaging one another, or a couple of diplomats shooting each other, or whatnot. Remember, nobody's going to fight to the death in a first contact, yeah? Because if, say, again, me and Drax's two ships are starting to shoot each other, I don't want to get killed because I don't want Drax people to be able to just look into my ship salvage and basically be like, so they've got all of this technology, this is how their systems work, this is their crew biology, this is that, and that. Fire a few rounds, maybe fight a bit, and then leave, okay? There's no reason for you to fight to the death anyway. This is one of those situations where you don't want to be doing that. And you don't want to be given a potential enemy an advantage. Also, nobody is going to be calling in any sort of fleets as an escalation to a first contact fight, okay? The most you will ever get in such a scenario is going to be a small patrol fleet. Say somebody's come onto your territory and a fight breaks out, okay? The most you're going to have is a small patrol fleet of like a couple of ships of small size that might turn up to help. That's the most, nobody is going to be bringing any hostile fleets into any other territory. Nobody's going to have any sort of like Titano battle fleets on immediate quick reaction standby to turn up in one fucking turn. Rallying any sort of military power takes time. Nobody cares if, this sudden republic just, like, you get into a bit of a kerfuffle on your border and then they bugger off again, like, cool, whatever. There's no, oh, well, now that we're enemies, I'm going to call in my 1,000 ship invasion force that was, like, somehow already ready to go, and then the other person's like, oh, well, I bring my 2,000 ship defense fleet that's already on quick reaction duty, and then the other person's like, oh, well, the 1,000 ships was my initial invasion force, and I have these 3,000, and it's just, I have seen that happen on plenty of occasions. You'd be amazed at the amount of times that first contacts have escalated into, like, outright retarded wars. It's just stupid. Don't do that, for God's sake. Just because a first contact went badly and people got shot does not mean that your nations are instantly at war. I cannot stress this enough, and if the rest of the discussion is just me saying these lines, it would still be a worthwhile discussion. Small skirmishes happen between nations, and nations don't jump into conflicts. Nations actively avoid conflicts, especially with new unknown powers. One of two things may happen after a shoot-up first contact, yeah? The two nations just leave each other alone. They're like, well, that was fucked up, they were kind of dicks, let's just not have anything to do with them. Or they might extend a diplomatic hand to one another and go, alright, that was a bit shit, want to actually hash this out with proper diplomats and maybe trying to, bridge the problems, and they clear things up. If both players do want the first contact to eventually escalate into a war, that's completely fine. That's awesome. But nobody is going to declare war over a botched first contact, okay? But the first contact can be used as a foundation for future interactions that lead to escalations that will eventually lead to war, okay? Just, Jesus Christ, don't, do that, okay? So, next segment, how to handle multinational diplomacy and multinational first contacts. So, big multiplayer diplomacy events and big multiplayer first contacts can be extremely fun events. They happen here all the time. They can also, however, get rapidly bogged down or have no direction. Okay? Especially if you're all just like, hey, all 5 of us, let's turn up and do this big first contact. Alright? Well, what's the outcome of that going to be? Because if you don't have a unified goal or an end goal for the RP, it's critically needed, because these RPs, more than anything else, tend to just stall out and nobody posts because nobody knows where anything is going to go. You want to have an end goal where you can push people together and have everyone going towards the same ending, okay? Adversity and challenge doesn't actually necessarily have to be introduced at these events artificially. So, say, for example, you're having a first contact with someone and you both decide to, introduce an extra element to make things interesting. You don't necessarily have to do that with these RPs, because typically players themselves are the challenge. Nobody's going to be perfectly aligned with one another, and there's going to be organic disagreements between, proposals or actions or things that happen in the, RP. And so the different players kind of have to, overcome some of the other players, or just, work together to overcome things, or just, you know, tripping over themselves, doing different things. And that could be completely fine. Just ensure that these sort of organic challenges don't get out of hand to the point where they're derailing the RP and preventing stuff from progressing. You know, just because, oh, well, my nation's a xenophobic, you know, what, so-and-so, they wouldn't do this, that, and the other, and because of that, I'm going to stonewall this RP. It's just what my faction would do. Well, I don't care what Mr. Faction would do. I care about what's good for the benefit of all of these players, fun-wise, and what's good for the story, alright? Take your, it's what my ex would do, and shove it up your ass, is pretty much my response. You know, don't let it get out of control. At the same sort of flip side of that, don't let anyone pull anything out of nowhere without first consulting other players, yeah? Any assassination attempts, especially in major diplomatic conferences with 10 plus people, will result in absolute chaos and the RP being wrecked beyond all recovery. Any major actions like that, for the love of God, be clear up with every single person before springing that into an RP. We're going to have an example later where I will tell you about the first Ancerious War Conference and the absolute travesty that was. But just don't do that, okay? And for first contacts, at least, where you're going to have multiple players involved, give them a goal, perhaps, you know, that's completely independent of that first contact. So, for example, 5 of you in this chat turn up to a particular location to investigate something, and you just so happen to meet each other's nations and then have first contacts on the spot. And, you know, it can help facilitate cooperation if you've all got a common goal in the RP, and it helps the flow, it helps even out any conflict, and it just helps things just go in a nice direction, yeah? So, you know, communication is always key with any major cooperative RP, and always effectively plan ahead for the desired outcome, okay? Because it will really help keep the RP on track. Because if everyone else is like kind of mumbling and doing something that doesn't really have anything to do with whatever, you can have another person in the diplomatic, you know, conference be like, all right, well, anyway, back on topic, what are we doing in regards to this? And it sends everything back on track. So if everyone knows what's going to happen, everyone knows that, you know, they can do their part to work towards that goal. So, what not to do in diplomacy and first contact RP? Well, we've gone over quite a bit of it, but, you know, don't go into diplomacy or first contacts with no plan or goal. They lose momentum and die, and players get bored really quickly. Don't, you know, RP in detail, diplomatic or first contacts, which could be done in smaller news and journal posts. It saves you infinite time and energy. I promise this is for your benefit. You know, I've switched to doing it. It's like I haven't done a proper first contact in a long time, and dear God, I'm so much happy for it. Do not mindlessly escalate a first contact into combat for little reason, obviously. A first contact that does turn into combat does not, you know, mean huge mean fleet fights, and it does not mean that you're at war or count as a valid casus belli. Sorry, dudes. Stellaris lied to you. Don't use the language barrier as a way to protect your nation from, like, outside influence. No language is untranslatable. Sorry. Don't stonewall any attempt at communication or contacts in an FC just because it's realistic. I don't care if you're super duper mega AI race. It's realistically this other person is unable to translate your stuff. I don't care. It's not beneficial to the RP. It slows everything down. It causes needless adversity when you should be focusing on how your nations will interact. And just don't do it. And if you're purposely doing it, don't be a dick. Don't pull out massive twists from nowhere, like assassinations and that, especially in multinational RPs, for God's sake. Always have an end goal or a goal for big diplomatic meetings. Don't have it be aimless or it will die. Again, something that I have experience with personally, and a lot of people do in Ancerious. Don't throw endless adversity at diplomacy RPs that should be, relatively straightforward. If your two nation leaders are going to, have a discussion about something, then there's no reason that, 46 invasions and a load of crazy stuff happens to make it interesting. And don't have your nations immediately in a first contact negotiate an alliance. You barely know one another, okay? Just have it be a foundational point to lead to further diplomacy. This is kind of another meme that existed a hell of a lot back in Ancerious' old days, where people would just be like, hey, I'm X Nation. Hey, I'm X Nation. We're allies now. And it's like, oh, alright. What? Yeah, like non-aggression pact at most. Like, yeah, we promise that we won't be doing anything to harm you or whatever it's all called. Maybe you could have a few trade agreements, initial stuff. Nothing like super duper like, hey, we're brotherly allies now because we just share the same ideology. Like, just doesn't happen. And also, as said, in comms text, don't do anything diplomatically or in a first contact where it's like, oh, well, my nation, because they're, say, psionic or magic or whatever, knows what your guys are thinking, so, we're just gonna, kind of railroad. Anything in a first contact or diplomacy where there's railroading going on, or, subtle soft god modding, just stop it. Nobody wants that at the end of the day. But yeah, if two nations meet and they have very sort of core God Jesus words today, very similar core beliefs and such, yeah, that's cool. They'd probably be on a lot better foundational grounds for then, having further interaction and close relations than, say, if a democratically elected government that has just broken out of a slave empire meets a slave empire has, for example. So, good examples of first contacts and sort of diplomacy in Ancerious. So, first off, first contact between the Union and the ASN, which is Blues Nation here. It was really fun and engaging. The ASN was a single world with, bare space flight going on, and the Union was a big galactic superpower. They turned up, they were like, hey, this is a new place, they seem relatively cool. And then the Union's very presence caused such a massive geopolitical upheaval on the planet between, all of these non-unified, essentially states, like modern Earth, that it almost caused an outright war. If I remember, it was actually almost a nuclear war. And the Union had to really carefully tread and navigate itself diplomatically until these different states and countries could organise a sort of formal united response. And even then, when they met face to face, it was in the remote ice fields to the south of the planet, and it pretty much ended with both sides just agreeing to have further diplomatic meetings because the ASN, this was their first real inkling into the galaxy at large, and the Union would sort of be their gateway to be like, hey, here's FTL, here's all this stuff, here's the AnkNet. And it eventually led to a really extensive partnership and good ties, down the line, and it was still one of my favourite first contacts I've ever done, to be perfectly honest with you. A good example of a multinational meeting was the third AGA meeting, the Ancerious Galactic Alliance. It was in the middle of 2AW, where everyone, had a goal in mind at this meeting. It was to discuss the various back and forth of the war, but there was events going on that effectively happened. They were discussing what they would do with the enemy after the war ended, how they were going to try and take down the big bad, how they were going to do this, that, and the other. And then there was a situation that was kind of out of nowhere, but that was in response to the firing of the Crucible, which is a big super weapon that destroys star systems, and that destroyed one of the present faction's systems. and then one of the other factions was kind of like, whatever, and that provoked an emotional response and some fighting, and yeah, while it was kind of drama in character and out of character, it was not that bad, and it kind of was just added to the adversity, and it was kind of a real breakthrough given that, you know, we have a cursed history of multinational meetings in the group. The next one was the diplomatic hosting RP, which Gauss, somebody who is no longer in the group, held. Blue will kind of back me up on this. It was a pretty fun, open-ended event where nations just kind of like turned up and then introduced themselves to one another, you know, spoke to each other, show off technology, etc. It led to several diplomatic situations between different factions, signing some treaties and the like. There were some really good character-focused interactions in that as well. Kind of building on from the ASN and Union meet, the sort of quote-unquote leaders of the Union and the ASN, like the characters, met in a completely informal circumstance. And it was probably one of the best character-to-character sort of like, we need to talk moments. And it was just awesome. But as Blue says in chat, it was kind of a free-for-all. So we had somebody just barge in halfway through and kind of cause a scene, and then it developed from there, and then there was some like tensions going on, and while it didn't have a uniform end goal in mind, and it didn't really have a uniform plot line, that was kind of a good example of open thing for loads of people, and then the players kind of make what they will out of it. It did get bogged down and kind of die out, and then it just got simply wrapped up, and that was fine because it was still really fun. But that's a good sort of like unorthodox idea. And the next one's kind of like really unconventional as well, and that's Tears. And Tears is not a diplomatic or first contact RP. It's a joint free trade hub that Chris, the player of Imaginarium, just kind of created and then invited anyone in the group to set up shop on this planet, which was going to be a free trade place, and they could just, sell stuff, do stuff, etc. And there was no direct RP for it. It was all done through news posts or signing up to this thing. And it brought a lot of nations into first contact, and, while stuff was done in journals and such, it helped facilitate diplomacy and first contact through its existence. So, because people were in Tears, they started interacting elsewhere. And it's a really good example of an unconventional approach to that, where you just don't have to be like, hey, does everyone want to do this, thing? You don't have to RP it, but, you can get people together to have these things going on. So, before I give you the Benny Hill recounting, does anyone have any questions or things you would like to bring up? Let's see. No? Okay. How would isolationist nations work in this sort of thing? So, it honestly depends, because isolationist nations come in sort of many shades, where you've got nations that are interactive on the galactic scene, but they don't like to get involved directly into big things, all the way up to, I don't want to have anything to do with anyone, please leave my borders. Now, for the first one, you have no problems when it comes to first contact or diplomacy. It just means that they're probably going to be more neutral focused. But if you have a nation which is like, I don't want to talk to you, I don't want to have anything to deal with you, this one's difficult, because those kind of nations, in my opinion, don't fit Nation RP. Because they're actively trying to avoid interaction, which is fundamentally against the whole point of a cooperative, interactive RP group. But If you are going to do that, I would recommend doing it through news posts, because there's no point in just turning up to an RP and being like, hello, would like to talk to you, and the other people going, no. And then you just turning around and leaving. So you would just do a news post, which is like, incident or contact along this border or whatnot. Yeah, Blue, if you want to chip in, go for it. Yeah, I think that really quite nicely sums it up. Uh, how exactly would a gestalt consciousness go about first contacts? Machine intelligence or hive mind, etc.? Well, pretty simply, to be honest. I don't really see how it would be different to anyone else. You know, you would make contact, you would conduct with diplomacy and whatnot. Yes, the machine intelligence or hive mind might be pretty alien, perhaps, to this other nation. Use that as some adversity, like how does that make them feel? Like, oh shit, there's like sentient machines out there. Does your nation not like machines? Well, maybe have that reflected in how they act. Still have them interact, because that's still something interesting, and they need to learn about them because they need to learn if they're a threat or not. But having a machine intelligence or a hive mind, in my opinion, will be no different than just having all the different weird types of nations. It just gives contextual spice to that first contact. It just helps define how your nation is going to interact in this first contact, rather than a set specific way. Because you might have, say, a really nice, welcoming hive mind, like in Ancerious, Funky My My, or you might have a rabid devouring swarm. Well, both are hive minds, but they're going to approach first contact in a pretty different fashion, depending on how angry my is at the time. But, you know, yeah, I don't really think it would be any massive difference to what's going on. So, yeah, um, the Ravenous My Collective, indeed. So, Siege, your question is kind of like nichely focused. I will answer it after the discussion, if that's okay. Um, so, if anyone doesn't have any outward questions for like the general thing, I will move on to the meme conference. So, Ancerious as a group does not have a good history or track record with multinational diplomatic events. And this all stems from the first one that ever happened in the middle of the First Ancerious War. And essentially what happened is the Union of Worlds, my faction, went, okay, there's a big war on, let's get everyone together and be like, let's try and end the war. And also, there's a load of big other bad guys out there, and we need to stop them, so maybe we should all come together and sort of like, you know, be at peace. So I invited a lot of other nations, and all in all, there were more than 10 players in that RP. So it kind of started with the whole, hey Tenebrae, hey Immortal Empire, do you want to, like, stop the war? The shit flinging started immediately, because, for those of you who don't know, a little TLDR, Tenebrae got attacked out of nowhere by the Immortal Empire and had their capital system glassed at the start of the war. So, as you can imagine, they weren't too happy. And the Immortal Empire were sort of like, I guess, winning at that point, so they had no reason to end the war. So there was a lot of back and forth about, you know, oh, well, who's to blame with the war, oh, blah, 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 blah. All while this is going on, okay, you then had, they sort of like split for a break, and my, I guess, character went and talked to the Immortal Empire and were like, yo, come on, give us something here. And there was going to be a little bit of like discussion, until Crag's character, Solon Reich, who I've talked about in another discussion, decided to, and bear in mind, this was back in the day where RRPs were not good quality, pull a gun and place it on the table in front of him. Now, I had specifically stated that nobody had been allowed in with weapons and that I'd searched everyone. But I wasn't online at the time, so Solon Reich casually pulled this gun out, placed it on the table while making a statement. The Coalition, which is another faction, next to him, go crazy and are like, there's a gun, there's a gun. One of their members tries to attack and subdue Reich, okay? My escorts for the diplomatic meeting then basically restrain the Coalition member, okay? Now, on top of this, somebody then barges into the conference claiming that one of the representatives was corrupted by this, like, evil god and beheads them on the spot. Now, the Coalition members then go, we're leaving. And my faction is like, no, nobody can leave at the moment, we've got a serious situation here. They break into the hangar bay, and, you know, my faction shuts down the hangar bay doors, so they blow their way out of the hangar bay, okay? And in the process, damage 2 of the other players' shuttles, yeah? One of the shuttles belongs to a sentient crystalline race. The shuttle responds to being attacked by shooting the Coalition shuttle and blowing it out of the sky. The death of the Coalition representatives then leads to the Coalition ship firing on the representative sentient ship. The sentient crystal ship being far bigger and far more heavily armed. The Coalition ship subsequently detonates. Now, my character's sort of like, you know, my faction's leader is just sort of standing there with this beheaded corpse on the floor, this burning hangar in front of him, a few more corpses from this, like, big fight. By the way, like, he's like, what the hell's going on? This other character from another faction then decides to half-resurrect the dead head of the woman who got beheaded to try and interrogate them for information on this big evil god. And my character just straight up goes, you know what? I'm calling the conference here. Get the fuck off of my station. And yeah, it kind of just didn't, you know, go well. And every single meeting that we have had since then has had something happen. So I believe at the first AGA conference, somebody got killed. The second AGA conference, the Restavian Guard attacked the Artificial representative because she made a snide remark about the death of, like, millions of his people. The APP conference had somebody get killed because there was a big duel between 2 representatives in the middle of it. Yeah. What other meetings was there? There was the FDC meeting where one of the factions just got up and denounced the main faction and was just like, "You're all a bunch of like manipulative twats," and left. Uh, you had the CAE meeting, which I think caused some problems. There, yeah, yeah, the Askandar Pact that was basically just like, we're making this in regards to the Andraken, and then the Andraken acted dumb, and they were like, if you continue, we're gonna have to like destroy your representative, and oh god, yeah. TLDR, if you are going to have a big multinational meeting in this group, be fucking careful because it's cursed. So yeah. Oh yeah, none of them were boring, but none of them went according to plan. So yeah. Anyway, that wraps up the discussion for tonight. So thank you all for coming, and I will see you again next week.